Hello, everyone. Does evil exist? Does evil exist? Well, that's not a new question. We know that Socrates said, "Evil is nothing." Of course, Socrates was the king of irony. When he said that evil was nothing, he meant something else. One had to shift one's perspective to understand what he was really saying. But in a certain way, there is meaning in this phrase. Evil is nothing. And it is on this question that I would like to reflect out loud today, particularly through a philosopher who is, unfortunately, quite little known to the general public, Leibniz. Leibniz is known for his work Essay on Theodicy. Theodicy is the analysis and study of the properties of God, and especially the question of the existence of evil on earth, evil that is allowed by God. In Leibniz's perspective, God exists. That is a fact for him, so we must obviously take this presupposition into account. In a secularized society, this presupposition is somewhat costly, but we will make the effort to play the game and start from the assumption that God exists. If we admit that God exists, then inevitably the question arises, why does evil exist? So, what do we call evil? Well, evil is wars that kill innocent civilians. Evil is diseases, viruses that also kill innocents. Evil is injustice. It is everything that makes people suffer when they did not deserve that suffering. That is evil. And the fact is that evil exists, the fact that people suffer without having been guilty of wrongdoing. Evil affects innocence, and that is precisely the definition of evil. It attacks the weak and the innocent. But Leibniz does not deny that evil exists in the strict sense. Rather, he tries to understand it and explain it. Leibniz's theodicy consists in understanding how evil can exist in a world created by God, God being defined as a perfect being, omnipotent and benevolent. How can he allow, how can he even accept that evil exists? It is this contradiction between the properties attributed to God and the existence of evil that leads Leibniz to question this major issue of theology. How can evil exist in a world created by God? This is, moreover, one of the objections often made to believers, especially religious believers. If your God is so perfect, if he can do everything, knows everything, and is good, why does he let people be massacred? Why does he allow diseases to kill innocents, natural disasters? Why? And the question is legitimate. However, Leibniz points out that when we ask this question, we are not attentive to something very important, which we might call the relativity of evil. What is the relativity of evil? Leibniz explains it quite simply. He tells us that the problem of human beings is that we are hypersensitive to evil, hypersensitive to suffering. We notice what is wrong, we notice suffering, we notice injustices, but we do not notice all the times when evil is not there. We do not notice all the times when everything is going well. You know, when we are sick, when we catch a bad flu or a stomach bug, suddenly we long for the time when we were not sick. We feel that the time when we were in good health, when we were not suffering, was a wonderful time, and it is only when we suffer, only when we are sick or unhappy, that we become aware of the happiness we feel when we are not sick or when there is no problem. We are attentive to what is wrong, but from a rational point of view, this is not logical. From a rational point of view, we should weigh all the moments when things go well against all the moments when they do not. And then we would realize something absolutely decisive. The moments when things go well are far more numerous than the moments when they do not. I once made a video in which I talked about the fact that excessive reflection, excessive and pathological rumination can lead us to create problems out of nothing. We human beings are very capable of creating misery out of nothing. And Eckhart, whom I quote in my video, has a sentence that is both extremely simple and full of common sense.
If you ask yourself, what is wrong right now, you will be quite embarrassed, because in reality, right now, there is no problem. There is no problem right now. The problem is always an anticipation of a future evil, and when the problem presents itself to us, when it becomes our present, we no longer have time to mentalize it, to think of it as a problem. We have to deal with it. If you are walking in the forest and suddenly you see a wild boar charging at you, do you think you will have time to say to yourself, "Oh, there is a problem"? It is your body that will understand there is a problem. It is your body that will possibly run away. It is your body that will react. So your mind at that moment is on standby. It has nothing more to say. Yet a problem is a mental notion. It is a projection of the mind that corresponds to the anticipation of a future evil. So evil is first of all a product of the mind. It is first of all a projection of the mind, and it is something we experience very differently depending on whether we project it, consider it, or live it. Anticipating a problem is not the same as living it. The relativity of evil is the fact that most of our evils are linked to the fact that we are not attentive to the good. We are not attentive to everything that is going well, to everything that works, and to everything that makes us happy. You know many people who have suffered from an illness and recovered from it, or people who have gone through very difficult trials and suffering and ultimately managed to overcome them. These people have a different approach to life, a different way of understanding happiness. For them, very little is enough to make them happy. It is as if the experience of evil produced in them a kind of awakening of sensitivity to good and to happiness. As if in the end, one had to go through trials and suffer to realize that, all things considered, life is actually quite good. Injustices exist, and this is a fact that Leibniz does not deny. Incidentally, a small aside, Leibniz is Pangloss in Voltaire's philosophical tale Candide, for those who have read it. Pangloss is the philosopher of optimism. He is the one who always finds a way to say that in the end, everything is fine, that everything is not so bad, and that we live, after all, in the best of all possible worlds. Voltaire wrote a poem on the Lisbon disaster, which I invite you to read, in which he ironized Leibniz's thought by emphasizing that sometimes death and suffering strike innocence, and that we cannot close our eyes on these injustices. Except that Leibniz does not close his eyes. On the contrary, Leibniz opens his eyes and invites us to open our eyes to the good. I spoke earlier about the relativity of evil. The relativity of evil is to say that we perceive evil only because we have knowledge of good, and that it is because we have experienced evil that we can perceive good. But there is another way to understand the expression relativity of evil. The other way is to say that evil is always in some way a step toward the good. So what does that mean? Are we not once again in the familiar discourse sometimes heard among spiritualists and blissful mystics, for whom everything must be accepted in the name of universal love and letting go, and who say that after all everything has meaning, so evil has meaning too? Yes, in a way. Yes, in a way. But the question is whether this is false. Is it false to say that evil is often an evil for a good? Is it false to say that evil is sometimes necessary to reach a form of good?
Here we find ourselves rather embarrassed, because generally this is the case. Our failures, our sufferings, our misfortunes allow us to understand the causes and origins of that suffering or misfortune. Evil always gives us a lesson, and once we are conscious of it and put it into practice, this lesson allows us not to fall back into error, and thus into suffering and misfortune. Nietzsche said that what does not kill us makes us stronger. This is a rather simple and yet quite telling way of expressing what Leibniz said about evil. When we are struck by a virus, to take a random example, we produce antibodies, and these antibodies will allow us to fight the virus if it ever appears again. It is an evil for a good.
You know that when we break a bone, it heals in such a way that it becomes much stronger than before. It is an evil for a good. In many situations in our lives, we act and make mistakes. We err and we fail. But if we pay attention to our mistakes, it is very possible that our error will turn into a lesson that will then allow us not to repeat the error. It is an evil for a good. An evil for a good is not just an expression. It is the observation that evil always has a double face, the subjective and immediate face, which is suffering, and then the objective face, which unfolds its effects only over time, which is learning. Evil teaches us things. How many among us have allowed themselves to be deceived, manipulated, or hurt by others, and have drawn lessons from it that immunized them against new attacks? This is not to say that this suffering is a good thing as suffering. It is to say that this suffering is a good thing as a means towards another end, towards an end that is personal growth. That is the function of evil for Leibniz, to help us progress. Everything we do wrong teaches us to do right. Error is a pedagogical necessity. Error is what we correct, and we cannot correct our behavior if we never make mistakes. Some will say, but we can do good without having gone through evil. We can have an innate sense of good and virtue. Yes, but the one who has gone through evil or through error, once he comes out of it, is aware of what evil is and what error is, and therefore he has much less chance of reproducing that error than someone who has simply never gone through it. Moreover, we must distinguish between error and fault. Error is what we all commit when we make mistakes in good faith. Fault is when we repeat that error while being aware that it is an error. To err is human. To persist in error is diabolical. Fault is persistence in error. We can persist in error and fall into fault. We can therefore repeat our errors and repeat evil. But at that point, it is not evil itself that is at fault. It is our inability to be aware of that evil, our inability to recognize it as evil. In that case, we are responsible.
There is no need to invoke God to justify or understand our own failings. There is no need to blame God for our errors. For if God created us fallible, if God created us imperfect, that does not mean we are not capable of reforming ourselves, evolving, and progressing. If God created evil, it is to push us toward good, to push us to overcome the evil within us, which presupposes being aware of it. Evil would therefore be the tool that allows human beings, because they have consciousness, to transform themselves and to tend toward the good until they reach it. Evil is nothing, not because evil does not exist, but because evil is only the product of human action. It is human beings who create evil, and human beings could decide, they could decree not to do evil. If humans do evil, it is because they have not yet drawn all the lessons from evil. I will take an example. I practiced boxing, and when you box, you get punched in the face, so it hurts, and it is never very pleasant to take punches, even when you have a fighter's mentality. But when you take blows to the face, there comes a moment when you no longer want to take them. So what do? You learn to dodge, you learn to counter, you learn to anticipate, you learn to minimize harm, you learn to avoid evil. And when you practice boxing, generally you do not want to fight in everyday life. You know that you can face aggression, that is true, but you do not like to fight, in the sense that you are aware that getting punched hurts, and you do not want to inflict that on someone else, even if sometimes they might deserve it. The experience of evil does not make you want to repeat the experience of evil. And that is Leibniz's philosophical message. The experience of evil leads to knowledge of evil, and knowledge of evil does not make us want to remain in the presence of evil. Admittedly, sometimes the lesson is long and laborious. It takes time to understand that we have done evil and that we no longer want to do it.
Generally, what happens is that we ourselves suffer the consequences of the evil we have committed, and we end up telling ourselves that it is a bad idea and that we would be better off doing something other than evil. And once we are conscious, once we are attentive to the consequences of our actions, we generally seek to avoid evil. We seek not to repeat it, quite simply because human beings naturally tend to flee evil. That is, to flee what makes them suffer. It is true that sometimes we allow ourselves to make others suffer, and it is only when we ourselves suffer that we question evil. That is true. But it is just as true that doing evil around us is the best way, sooner or later, to direct that evil back toward ourselves. As Spinoza said, everything is only cause and effect. And very generally, when we amuse ourselves by doing evil around us, we create the conditions for that evil to come back and hit us squarely in the face. There is nothing mystical about it. It is a purely mechanical and physical law. Action, reaction. Do harm to someone and expect that soon it will be your turn. The relativity of evil is the idea that evil is always interdependent with good. They are the two sides of the same coin. Just as day needs night, just as gravity needs lightness. And if we made a small effort to notice what is going well, we would be a little less sensitive and therefore a little less subject to evil. The conclusion of this video is that if evil exists, it is first of all because we allow it to exist, perhaps also because we do not have the right strategy to face it. We do not overcome evil by fighting it, that is, by fixing our attention on it. We overcome evil by doing good. We overcome evil by focusing on the good. Thank you.